Tonight, we're talking all about choices, and we know we've certainly got a big one ahead of us in November, obviously in the middle of the election year, and the two parties laid out two very distinct visions for America's future, two paths forward, if you will, and you, the American public, you got two very important choices that you can either choose between, and you have to make a decision which vision fits your idea of the path America ought to go on and the path that's going to get us closer to where we as a nation want to be. Tonight, we're going to attempt to try and make clear what those choices are and which party's vision suits you. And we got a terrific guest who's going to help us represent that, the GOP perspective. Representative Nan Hayworth of New York's Hudson Valley. Also joining us on the panel tonight, as always, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. Guys, welcome very much. All right. We're going to get into everything from dollars and cents, social issues, all the things we're going to hear about on the campaign trail. But let's first start with the issue of tone and the partisanship that is Washington. The approval rating of Congress, it's at 14%. Some numbers have that even substantially less than that. The favorability rating of the federal government as a whole, lowest that it's been in 15 years, according to a recent Pew poll. Partisanship, it could have a lot to do with that number. We're used to every night seeing one fight or another, very little in the way of consensus when it comes to Capitol Hill. 3/4 of the public say the federal government is too divided along those party lines, while only 20% say the federal government can work together to get anything done. So, is this bitter partisanship to be blamed here on a new phenomenon called the Tea Party? Certainly Washington was divided before that. You came in with the class. What do you think?
Well, people are justifiably frustrated, Richard, because they do see, and I see it all across our Hudson Valley, they do see that our economy is failing to function as we all know it could. We're accustomed as Americans to upward mobility, generation upon generation, doing better. And now we see that, and I have a college graduate in my home, I'm happy to say, my older son graduated on Saturday. Half of college graduates don't have jobs. That seems un-American somehow. So they're frustrated with everyone whom they see at the federal level somehow not getting that job done. And I think that's a big part of the general impression people have.
Well, to some, though, the idea of cooperation is the same as capitulation. We've seen some long-time basic institutions in Washington that you've probably got to see on the Senate side here that are either out the door or on the way out the door. I mean, Bennett in Utah, Lugar in Indiana, Orrin Hatch very possibly in Utah, all long-standing conservative Republicans who lost in primaries because, among other things, they either weren't conservative enough or that to some they aided and abetted the other side here. In fact, I want to, if I could, Dick Lugar, 36 years, institution out of Indiana.
Senator.
Yeah, okay, and you know him well. Well, this is what the person you lost the primary to, Mr. Murdoch, had to say on the election night. And on primary night, he made it very clear here that what he saw the problem with Dick Lugar was not the problem that he'd see with him, that frankly, that he would move in another direction, that for him, the idea of working with the other side wasn't going to work. And here again is the quote, which is more specifically, hey, if I win here, and let's take a listen to Mr. Murdoch himself.
I have a mindset that says bipartisanship ought to consist of Democrats coming to the Republican point of view. You know, I've said many times through this campaign that one of the things I hope to do is to help build a conservative Republican majority in the United States Senate and continue to help the House build a Republican majority and have a Republican White House. And then bipartisanship becomes having Democrats come our way.
You agree with him?
Well, I'm one of the Republicans who reaches across the aisle.
So you're the
one thing. Yeah. No, there are many, and the House of Representatives in particular, virtually every bill we've passed and sent to the Senate has had Democratic colleagues vote with us. And there have been certain shifts, and not all Republicans have voted with every bill. Speaker Boehner, in particular, believes in the House working its will. And we believe we have an open process, which was not the case in the previous two Congresses. So Democrats and Republicans, both parties, members of both parties, have a voice in the legislation that we pass.
No, but you heard him clearly say, and Andrew, you can jump in, he clearly said, and this is why a lot of people thought Dick Lugar lost. My idea of cooperation is them agreeing with me. No longer will we go along to get along. And principle, they argue, is more important than politics. And that sounds good, But look at some of the consequences we've seen here, and we're about to get into, once again, with another debt limit fight. And when I say that out loud, we were talking on the show, and we had Republicans and Democrats on, they all rolled their eyes and said, we never thought we'd see this again. Yet we're staring at the possibility of another debt limit fight.
I would love not to see another debt limit fight. There's no question, because I'd love to see our debt not reach that point. We all know, unfortunately, and this is the crux of it, Richard. It's not Democrat versus Republican. Richard Murdoch's race in Indiana was that race. Let's talk about the broad picture, which is that we have reached in our history a state of fiscal crisis in terms of domestic policy that we've never been at before. We have never been in such precarious circumstances without being engaged in a total war, World War II. So we have a debt that the federal government has accumulated over decades under Republican and Democratic presidents and Congresses alike. It's not a partisan issue that now we have to face and deal with, and that's a very challenging thing to do.
The lack of an active solution, the sense that people aren't getting a solution from Washington, I think does speak a lot to partisanship. And you were mentioning before, the bills that you passed through the House have had Democrats voting for it, which is not unusual, but there's a difference between that and the kind of bill that Democrats can agree on, let's say, on the Senate side, or that a compromise can be reached where you can actually find agreement between the bills that pass the House and the bills that pass the Senate. And there have been example after example of bills where that's simply not been possible because there isn't enough give and take, there isn't enough compromise beyond getting 2 or 3 straggling Democrats to support a bill. Fair
enough, Andrew, but let's look at the record. The House of Representatives has passed well over 40 bills at this point. I don't even, we've passed so many with Democratic and Republican votes almost always that I don't even have the exact number, but I will tell you that roughly 90% of them have not been acted on by the Senate. So if you look and say, where's the roadblock, you've got to say it's at the Senate.
But they would argue that the roadblock's coming from the House as well, because you're giving them legislation that they can't pass, and that you're not finding in the middle of the road.
Let's keep it to the debt limit fight here. And this isn't.
There's got to be a better.
Okay, but let's go back. Level of as much as when I say it, I can see you shuddering, Dominic, when I say debt limit fight, because we did this last summer, and I think we all swore never again here. But let's take a look at a couple of the polls here. And one is, who was to blame for the fight that we had last year? Now, the American public, this is a national poll, and the number that came out clearly pointed the finger directly to Jimmy. 58%, they believe there's more partisan politics here. But then when asked on the debt fight poll who was to blame for the debt ceiling, 47% said congressional Republicans, and less than 30% said the president and Democrats. And then when you go forward as to where we go with the debt limit fight, it was no secret. It was a fiasco for you guys. And I, for the life of me, don't know why you'd want to relive that again, because we all know the Senate's not going to go along with where you guys are pushing, and the president would never sign. So now we're going to go back to a situation where potentially our credit is downgraded as a nation again. We become a laughingstock. The economy's hurt. Why are we doing this?
Well, Richard, I would say the focus that you've taken in the first several minutes of our discussion here is emblematic, in a sense, of what our problem is. Instead of focusing on questions of partisanship, let's focus, as I do, on solving the problem. How do we resolve the issue of
you guys had a super committee, right? You were part of the super committee, right?
I was part of a different committee, a conference committee on the payroll tax holiday extension.
We had a super committee, so we wouldn't get into this thing again. And the deal was, if you guys couldn't reach an agreement, there was benchmarks, mandated cuts that were going to happen here, so we wouldn't have to go through this rigmarole all over again. And some of those cuts were to defense as well as to other social programs, et cetera. We have a deal. Why don't we go to what the super committee agreed to? Why do we have to go to Plan B? I thought that was the whole point of this.
Well, when we look at, let's look at the House of Representatives and how we got to the composition of the House that we did. And in fact, it was Nancy Pelosi as Speaker in November of 2010 who gathered us all together as freshmen and said, and she was very optimistic and upbeat. And she said, the House of Representatives is the immediate voice of the American people. We refresh ourselves every 2 years. So if you look at it from that perspective, the composition of the House of Representatives currently favors members who have vowed, as I did, to tackle deficit and debt and not to raise taxes. And when we talk about the challenges that we've faced between Senate and House, when we talk about the conference committee and the super committee in particular and why it came to an impasse, it's because we could not, unfortunately, we could not get the Senate in particular, and the president played into this too, to craft an agreement that we could even modify the tax code but not raise net taxes.
This is where the 10-to-1, or one of the areas where the 10-to-1 deal came in, where it was if for every $10 in spending cuts, if there was $1 in tax increases, would you be willing to go along with that? And Speaker Boehner agreed to that with President Obama and was rejected in the House.
I don't think he did, but I will say this. There is broad agreement, and President Obama, and I'm happy to agree with the president whenever I can, and there have been many times that I've voted in a way that the president would agree with, I think about 32% of the time or something. But there's been broad agreement that we can modify the tax code productively without raising net taxes.
But
that's where we need to go.
Isn't there a more basic thing that, my kids would get? You have a deal, you live by the deal. The deal was so we didn't have another debt limit fight, so we didn't threaten to default on our debts as a nation, so we didn't downgrade the credit. We're going to go with the super committee said. Now, the super committee was made up of Republicans and Democrats.
Mm-hmm. And it's the defense cuts that a lot of Republicans are saying we can't have the defense cuts.
Well,
and I don't love cutting the defense, but I'm saying...
You know what? It's our current Secretary of Defense, Secretary Panetta, who has stated eloquently that we actually can't afford
100%
to go there.
He did say
and
that. But
he's a member of this administration.
But the idea
so
is,
we're heeding his call.
Okay,
in the House
but there
plan.
was a deal, and now it seems we're reneging on the deal.
No, it's not a matter of reneging on the deal, Richard. It is a matter of, because the deal, if you will, the principle of the deal or the plan.
Cuts across the board.
Well, the principle of the plan was that we would take definitive action to reduce our debt, to reduce deficit spending.
And that's a good point to jump to a break on. Because when we come back from the break, there are two clear plans, or at least, to be fair, the Republicans laid out a clear plan. The Ryan plan's out there. And you can argue the president has laid out his vision as clearly. So we're going to get into the Ryan plan. I know you support it, and so does Republican nominee Mitt Romney.